We're going in a different direction, Glenn said, his eyes fixed on his phone screen as he typed what I could only assume was another text to her. Sienna brings fresh perspectives that align with our evolving brand vision. I watched through the glass partition as the blonde 20-something adjusted her designer blazer, practicing what looked like a power pose in the reflection of our conference room windows. 6 months later, I would walk through those same doors as the new CEO of Meridian Creative, watching Glenn's face crumble as he realized his mistake had cost him everything. But let me start from the beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Because this story isn't just about revenge. It's about justice. It's about what happens when a man lets his midlife crisis destroy the empire that someone else built for him. My name is Hannah Walsh, and for 7 years I was the invisible architect behind Meridian Creative's transformation from a struggling boutique agency into Chicago's most sought-after marketing powerhouse. While Glenn Parker played the charming face of the company, networking at industry galas and taking credit at award ceremonies, I was the one burning through weekends, developing the campaigns that put us on the map. I was the strategist behind the Morrison Hotels rebrand that earned us our first major industry recognition. I was the creative director who convinced Lakefront Beverages to trust a small Chicago agency with their national campaign launch. I was the operations mastermind who scaled our team from 12 employees to over 60 without losing the innovative edge that made us special. For 7 years, I believed we were building something together. I thought Glenn valued my contributions, respected my expertise, understood that our success was a partnership even if his name was on the door. I was wrong about everything except the part where I had built something extraordinary. I just hadn't realized yet that I had built it for myself, not for him. The conference room felt unusually cold that Tuesday morning in March, despite the spring sunshine streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our River North office. Chicago's skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a reminder of the city we had conquered together through sheer determination and brilliant work. The Willis Tower gleamed in the distance, and I could see the lake shimmering beyond the urban sprawl, the same view that had inspired some of our most creative campaigns. Glenn sat across from me at the polished conference table where we had celebrated so many victories. The table where we had toasted the Morrison Hotels contract that saved us during our 2nd year. The same surface where we had spread out the creative boards for the Lakefront Beverages campaign that tripled our revenue and established us as serious players in the national market. Every major milestone of our company's growth had been planned, celebrated, or strategized at this very table. But today, the familiar space felt foreign, charged with intention I couldn't quite identify. Glenn's usual confident demeanor seemed strained, and he kept glancing toward the outer office where I could see Sienna Martinez arranging papers at what used to be our intern station. She was young, maybe 25, with the kind of effortless beauty that stops conversations and the eager energy of someone who had never failed at anything because she'd never attempted anything difficult. I had noticed Glenn paying increasing attention to Sienna over the past few months since we'd hired her as a junior account coordinator. What had started as mentoring sessions had evolved into longer lunches, frequent closed-door meetings, and the kind of lingering glances that make everyone in an office uncomfortable. I had assumed it was a harmless flirtation that would burn itself out once Glenn remembered he was a 47-year-old CEO with a reputation to protect. I was naive to think it would stay harmless. "Hannah," Glenn began, his voice carrying that practiced tone he used when delivering difficult news to clients. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about the future direction of Meridian Creative." The words sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't yet articulate why. Something in his delivery, too formal, too rehearsed, suggested this wasn't going to be a typical strategy session. "Our industry is evolving rapidly," he continued, still not meeting my eyes directly. "Clients are looking for fresh energy, new perspectives, innovative approaches that speak to younger demographics." I felt my stomach tighten. Fresh energy, new perspectives, the corporate euphemisms that usually preceded bad news. "I agree," I said carefully, trying to read his expression. "That's why we've been expanding our digital capabilities and bringing in younger talent like Sienna." Glenn's jaw twitched almost imperceptibly at the mention of her name. "Yes, exactly. Sienna has been incredibly impressive in her first few months here. She has insights into millennial and Gen Z consumer behavior that could really transform how we approach campaigns. I nodded, though something felt wrong about the direction of this conversation. Sienna was smart and eager, but she was still learning the basics of account management. Her insights consisted mainly of suggesting that every campaign needed more social media integration and influencer partnerships, hardly revolutionary thinking in 2024. She's definitely shown potential, I agreed diplomatically. More than potential, Glenn said, finally looking directly at me. I think she represents the future of what agencies like ours need to become. Young, digitally native, instinctively connected to the audiences that drive purchasing decisions. The pit in my stomach was growing larger. I had heard enough corporate restructuring presentations to recognize the setup for what was coming. Glenn, I said slowly, what exactly are you trying to tell me? He took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders in the way he did before delivering presentations to difficult clients. I've decided to promote Sienna to creative director. She'll be taking over leadership of the creative department and client strategy. The words hit me like ice water. Creative director, my title, my role, my department that I had built from nothing into the engine that drove our entire company's success. I see, I managed to say, though my voice sounded distant to my own ears. And what would my role be in this new structure? Glenn's discomfort was visible now, red creeping up his neck as he delivered the killing blow. We're going in a different direction with senior leadership. Your last day will be April 15th. That gives us 2 weeks for a smooth transition. The room seemed to tilt slightly as the full impact of his words sank in. 7 years of my life. 7 years of 60-hour weeks, missed family dinners, sacrificed weekends, and creative breakthroughs that had made Glenn wealthy and successful. All of it reduced to a 2-week transition period and a corporate euphemism about different directions. I sat in stunned silence, watching Glenn fidget with his phone while I processed the magnitude of what he had just done. Through the glass partition, I could see Sienna laughing at something on her computer screen, completely oblivious to the fact that she was about to inherit an empire she had played no role in building. Nothing personal, Hannah, Glenn added, as if that phrase could somehow soften the betrayal. You've done incredible work here, but companies have to evolve or die. Sienna brings the kind of contemporary perspective our clients are demanding. Contemporary perspective. The man who had begged me to stay when 3 different agencies tried to poach me was now reducing my 7 years of expertise to an outdated perspective that needed replacing. I found my voice, though it sounded steadier than I felt. I understand. When would you like me to begin the transition process? Glenn looked relieved that I wasn't arguing or making a scene. Tomorrow, if possible. I'd like Sienna to shadow you on all current campaigns so she can hit the ground running. Shadow me. Train my replacement. Train his girlfriend to take credit for strategies I had developed and relationships I had spent years building. Of course, I said, standing slowly from my chair. I'll make sure Sienna has everything she needs to succeed. Glenn smiled, completely missing the careful emphasis I had placed on everything she needs. He thought he was getting rid of a problem. What he had actually done was declare war on the only person who truly understood how to keep his company running. As I walked toward the conference room door, my mind was already racing through possibilities that Glenn couldn't begin to imagine. He thought he was making a smart business decision, upgrading his creative leadership while securing his relationship with Sienna. What he had actually done was hand me the motivation to destroy everything he thought he owned. And the beautiful irony? He had also handed me the legal means to do it. Upgrade a key plan. To understand the magnitude of Glenn's betrayal, you need to understand what I had built for him. When I joined Meridian Creative 7 years ago, the agency was hemorrhaging money and clients. Glenn had big dreams about revolutionizing Chicago's marketing landscape. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But dreams without execution are just expensive fantasies. The agency occupied a cramped floor in a converted warehouse in an unfashionable part of the West Loop. with outdated equipment, a skeleton crew of 12 overworked employees, and a client roster that read like a collection of businesses that couldn't afford better representation. Glenn had founded Meridian with his MBA confidence and family money, but after 2 years, both his confidence and his trust fund were running dangerously low. I was 28 then, fresh from a senior position at McCann Erickson, where I'd been pigeonholed as the digital girl, despite having twice the creative vision of the executives taking credit for my campaigns. Glenn hired me as senior creative strategist for $72,000 a year, a significant pay cut from my previous position, but the promise of creative freedom and genuine partnership was intoxicating. Within 3 months, I had completely restructured our creative process. The old model relied on brainstorming sessions that produced generic concepts and client presentations that looked like they were assembled from stock templates. I implemented a research-driven approach that started with deep consumer psychology analysis and built campaigns from authentic insights rather than surface-level demographics. My first major victory was the Morrison Hotels account. They were a boutique chain with 5 properties in the Midwest, struggling to differentiate themselves in a market dominated by major brands. Their previous agency had given them a generic, luxury experience campaign that could have been used by any hotel chain in America. I spent 2 weeks living in their properties, talking to guests, observing staff interactions, and understanding what actually made their hotels special. What I discovered was that Morrison Hotels attracted creative professionals, writers, artists, designers, who chose them not for luxury amenities but for inspirational environments that sparked creativity. The campaign I developed, Where Ideas Sleep, positioned Morrison Hotels as the secret weapon of Chicago's creative class. Instead of showcasing thread counts and marble bathrooms, we featured real guests in the act of creation, a novelist writing her breakthrough chapter in the Lincoln Park location's library nook, a startup founder sketching his revolutionary app design on napkins in the Gold Coast Properties Cafe. The campaign didn't just win awards, it increased Morrison's bookings by 340% in 6 months and established us as an agency that understood how to connect with contemporary consumers on an emotional level. Glenn gave the presentation to their board while I sat in the back taking notes, but every creative professional in Chicago knew who had really conceived that campaign. The Morrison success led to our breakthrough moment, Lakefront Beverages. They were a century-old Chicago brewery that had been slowly losing market share to craft beer startups and national brands. Their board was split between preserving their traditional image and modernizing for younger consumers. Previous agencies had recommended either going full hipster craft or doubling down on heritage messaging, both approaches that would have alienated half their potential market. I saw an opportunity that everyone else had missed. Lakefront's problem wasn't their identity. It was that they had forgotten how to tell their story in a way that mattered to modern consumers. Chicago wasn't just their location, it was their essence. The city's resilience, creativity, and blue-collar authenticity were perfectly aligned with what younger drinkers valued in a beer brand. The Brewed in Chicago, Born for Everywhere campaign transformed Lakefront from a regional relic into a national symbol of authentic American brewing. We didn't change their recipe or their factories. We changed how people understood what those things represented. The campaign featured real Lakefront employees, the third-generation brewmaster whose grandfather had survived Prohibition, the packaging designer who was also a muralist in Pilsen, the quality control manager who moonlighted as a blues musician. Within 18 months, Lakefront had expanded distribution to 12 states and increased revenue by 280%. More importantly for Meridian, the campaign attracted attention from major national brands who wanted to work with the agency that understood how to make heritage feel contemporary. Glenn, of course, became the face of our success. He gave the keynote speeches at industry conferences, accepted the awards at ceremonies, and graced the covers of marketing magazines as, quote, Chicago's creative visionary. I didn't mind then. I was learning, growing, and building something extraordinary. The recognition would come eventually, I told myself. By year 4, I was essentially running creative operations, while Glenn focused on business development and industry networking. We had grown to 35 employees, moved to our current River North offices, and established ourselves as the go-to agency for brands that wanted to connect authentically with younger consumers. The Riverside Banking campaign in year 5 showcased my evolution as a strategist. Traditional bank marketing focused on security, stability, and traditional values. messaging that completely failed to resonate with millennials who had lived through the 2008 financial crisis and associated traditional banking with economic inequality. Instead of fighting those perceptions, I built a campaign that acknowledged them. Banking that actually works for you didn't pretend that young people should trust financial institutions. It positioned Riverside as the bank that had earned trust through transparent practices and genuine commitment to customer success. We featured real customers explaining how Riverside had helped them buy their first homes, start their businesses, or recover from financial setbacks. The campaign drove a 190% increase in new accounts among consumers aged 25 to 40 and won the Grand Prix at the Chicago Advertising Awards. Glenn accepted the award naturally, though by then industry insiders knew who was really driving Meridian's creative excellence. Year 6 brought our most ambitious project, the Illinois Tourism Board contract. State tourism marketing is notoriously bland, usually featuring generic scenic shots and forgettable slogans. I convinced the board to let us take a completely different approach. Illinois More Than You Think challenged people's preconceptions about the state by showcasing unexpected experiences and hidden gems. Instead of predictable shots of the Chicago skyline, we featured the underground jazz scene in Peoria, the world-class wineries in the Shawnee Hills, the surprising art installations scattered across rural communities. The campaign generated $47 million in additional tourism revenue and positioned Illinois as a must-visit destination for experience-seeking travelers. More importantly for Meridian, it demonstrated our ability to handle complex, multi-stakeholder projects that required both creative excellence and political sensitivity. Each success built our reputation and Glenn's wealth, but it also built something else: my leverage. Because while Glenn was collecting awards and giving interviews, I was quietly ensuring that my contributions were documented, protected, and legally secured in ways he never bothered to understand. The foundation I had built was about to become the weapon that would destroy him. Contemporary perspective, Glenn repeated, as if saying it again would make the betrayal sound more reasonable. Sienna understands social media culture in ways that our traditional approaches simply can't match. I stared at him across the conference table, watching this man I had spent 7 years making wealthy reduce my expertise to traditional approaches. Traditional. As if the campaigns that had revolutionized how Chicago agencies connected with younger consumers were somehow outdated because they came from someone over 30. The morning sun streaming through our floor-to-ceiling windows cast harsh shadows across Glenn's face, emphasizing the lines around his eyes that he'd been trying to hide with increasingly expensive skincare treatments. At 47, Glenn Parker was fighting a losing battle against time, and apparently he thought firing me and promoting his 25-year-old girlfriend would somehow win him that war. "Glenn," I said carefully, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest, "Sienna has been here for 4 months. She's worked on exactly 2 campaigns, both as a junior team member. Are you seriously suggesting that 4 months of entry-level experience qualifies her to run creative operations for a 60-person agency?" Glenn's jaw tightened, and I saw a flash of something ugly cross his face, the look of a man who knew he was making an indefensible decision but was too proud to admit it. "Experience isn't everything, Hannah. Sometimes fresh eyes see opportunities that experience blinds us to." Fresh eyes. I almost laughed at the euphemism. What Glenn saw when he looked at Sienna wasn't fresh eyes. It was everything he thought he was losing as he approached 50. Youth, beauty, the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having been told you're not good enough. "I see," I said, my voice growing colder. "And what exactly are these opportunities that my experience has blinded me to?" Glenn shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unprepared for me to challenge his decision with actual questions. "Well, for instance, the Morrison Hotels renewal. Sienna suggested that we pivot the campaign toward Instagram-friendly experiences and influencer partnerships." I felt something snap inside me. The Morrison Hotels renewal. The account I had built from nothing, nurtured for 5 years, and grown into a $2.8 million annual contract. The campaign that had established our entire reputation in the hospitality sector. "The Morrison renewal that I've been managing for 6 months?" I asked. "The strategy I developed after conducting focus groups with their target demographic and analyzing booking patterns across all their properties? The campaign that their CEO specifically requested I personally oversee because of our history together? Glenn's face reddened slightly. Yes, well, Sienna brings a different energy to client relationships. Different energy. There it was, the real reason behind this decision, barely disguised beneath corporate speak. Glenn wasn't promoting Sienna because she was more qualified. He was promoting her because she made him feel young, powerful, and desirable in ways that my competence and professionalism never could. I have to ask, I said, leaning forward slightly. Have you discussed this transition with any of our major clients? Morrison Hotels, Lakefront Beverages, Riverside Banking. They all have contractual clauses requiring specific personnel on their accounts. Glenn's expression shifted, and I could see that he hadn't considered this complication. Of course he hadn't. Glenn had always been better at grand gestures than details, which was why he needed someone like me to handle the actual business of running a successful agency. I'm sure they'll adjust, he said, though his voice lacked conviction, once they see what Sienna can bring to their campaigns. What Sienna can bring, I repeated slowly. Glenn, 3 of our top 5 clients specifically requested that I remain their primary strategic contact. Morrison Hotels' CEO told me last month that working with me was the best decision his company had made in the past decade. Are you planning to explain to him that you're replacing me with someone who's never managed a client relationship larger than $50,000? Glenn's discomfort was becoming more obvious by the minute. He kept glancing toward the outer office where Sienna was visible through the glass partition, as if her presence could somehow justify what he was doing. Look, Hannah, he said, his tone becoming more defensive. I know this seems sudden, but I've been thinking about this for months. The industry is changing rapidly, and we need to stay ahead of those changes. Months. He'd been planning this betrayal for months while I worked overtime to secure our biggest client renewals, while I developed the strategies that would carry us through the next year, while I trusted him as a partner instead of recognizing him as a threat. The industry is changing, I agreed. That's why we've increased our digital capabilities by 400% over the past 2 years. That's why we've hired 6 new employees under 30 in the past year alone. That's why we've developed proprietary analytics tools that our competitors are trying to replicate. Yes, but that's also why, I continued, my voice growing sharper, our revenue has increased 67% since last year, why we've won more industry awards than any other Chicago agency, and why clients are signing longer contracts with higher retainers. Glenn fell silent, unable to argue with the numbers because the numbers were irrefutable. Meridian Creative was more successful than it had ever been, and everyone in the industry knew that success was built on my strategies, my client relationships, and my ability to translate cultural trends into profitable campaigns. Sometimes, Glenn said finally, business decisions aren't just about current performance. They're about positioning for future growth. Future growth. As if the woman who had grown his agency from 12 employees to 60, from regional obscurity to national recognition, couldn't be trusted with the future she had already been building. I stood slowly, smoothing my skirt and gathering my dignity around me like armor. Through the glass partition, I could see Sienna laughing at something on her phone, completely oblivious to the conversation that was reshaping both our futures. When would you like me to start the transition? I asked, my voice professionally neutral despite the storm raging inside me. Glenn looked relieved that I wasn't arguing further. If possible, I'd like Sienna to begin shadowing you tomorrow. 2 weeks should be enough time to bring her up to speed on your current projects. 2 weeks, 7 years of expertise, client relationships, and institutional knowledge compressed into a 2-week crash course for someone whose primary qualification was her ability to make my boss feel young again. Of course, I said, moving toward the door. I'll make sure Sienna gets everything she needs to succeed. Glenn smiled, completely missing the careful emphasis I placed on those final words. He thought he was getting rid of a problem, upgrading his team while securing his midlife crisis romance. What he had actually done was declare war on the one person who understood exactly how fragile his empire really was. And unlike Glenn, I had spent years preparing for this possibility. While he was busy playing the charming CEO, I had been quietly building safeguards, protections, and leverage that he didn't even know existed. As I reached for the door handle, I allowed myself a small smile. Glenn thought he held all the power in this situation. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in corporate humiliation disguised as professional courtesy. Glenn insisted on personally walking me through the transition framework, as if I hadn't been essentially running creative operations for the past 3 years, while he focused on golf games and industry networking events. "I'll need comprehensive documentation of all your current projects," Glenn said, settling behind his mahogany desk while gesturing for me to take the chair across from him, the same chair where clients sat when they were receiving bad news about budget overruns or missed deadlines. The power dynamic was deliberate and unmistakable. I pulled out my tablet and opened a new document, though my mind was racing through calculations that had nothing to do with project timelines. "Of course. Would you like me to prioritize by revenue, strategic importance, or completion timeline?" "All of the above," Glenn replied, consulting his leather-bound planner with the kind of theatrical importance he usually reserved for client presentations. "Sienna will need to understand every aspect of your role if she's going to maintain our momentum." Momentum. The momentum I had built through 7 years of strategic brilliance, client relationship management, and creative innovation. The momentum that existed because I had transformed his failing agency into Chicago's most sought-after marketing powerhouse. "The Morrison Hotel's renewal is scheduled for final presentation next month," I said, making notes while watching Glenn's face for any sign that he understood the magnitude of what he was asking. "That's a $2.8 million contract. I've been developing the campaign strategy for 6 months, working directly with their CEO and marketing director." Glenn nodded as if this was perfectly normal information to transfer to someone with 4 months of experience. "Sienna's actually very excited about that project. She has some innovative ideas about integrating TikTok content and virtual reality experiences." I almost laughed. TikTok content and virtual reality for a boutique hotel chain whose primary clientele were creative professionals in their 30s and 40s. It was exactly the kind of surface-level, buzzword-driven thinking that clients paid us to avoid. "I'm sure she does," I managed to say. "The Lakefront Beverages campaign is also in active development. We're 3 weeks into a 6-month brand evolution project that involves market research across 12 states and coordination with their distributors, retailers, and regulatory teams." Right, Glenn said, making notes that looked more like doodles. "That's the beer company. Sienna thinks we should explore partnerships with lifestyle influencers and maybe some kind of sustainable packaging angle." Sustainable packaging. For a campaign that was focused on heritage storytelling and authentic Chicago identity. Glenn clearly hadn't bothered to read a single creative brief or strategy document in months. The conversation continued for another hour, with Glenn outlining his expectations while demonstrating a complete lack of understanding about what my job actually involved. He wanted Sienna to shadow me for 2 weeks, as if 7 years of institutional knowledge, client relationships, and strategic thinking could be downloaded like a software update. "I should probably bring Sienna in so you two can start working together," Glenn said finally, standing and straightening his tie. "I know you'll find her enthusiasm refreshing." This was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The face-to-face introduction to my replacement. The woman who would sit in my chair, use my strategies, and take credit for my relationships. Glenn opened his office door and called across the workspace. "Sienna, could you join us for a few minutes?" She approached with the confident stride of someone who had never been told she wasn't qualified for something, her smile bright and expectant. She wore a designer blazer that probably cost more than most of our junior employees made in a month, and her hair was styled in the kind of effortless waves that actually required significant effort to achieve. "Sienna," Glenn said, his voice warming noticeably, "I'd like you to meet Hannah Walsh, our current creative director. Hannah, this is Sienna Martinez, who will be taking over your responsibilities." Sienna extended her hand with practiced enthusiasm, her grip firm, and her eye contact direct. "Hannah, I've heard so much about you. Glenn is always talking about the amazing work you've done here." Her smile seemed genuine, and her enthusiasm appeared authentic. Under different circumstances, I might have liked her. She had intelligence in her eyes and the kind of ambitious energy that reminded me of myself 7 years ago. But these weren't different circumstances, and the fact that she seemed like a decent person only made the situation more surreal. "It's nice to meet you, Sienna," I replied, maintaining my professional demeanor despite the absurdity of the situation. I look forward to working with you over the next 2 weeks. I'm so excited to learn from you, she said, her enthusiasm seemingly genuine. I know I have enormous shoes to fill, but Glenn has so much confidence in my ability to bring fresh energy to the team. Enormous shoes to fill. Fresh energy. The corporate buzzwords that would apparently justify replacing 7 years of proven excellence with 4 months of eager inexperience. I'm sure you'll do wonderfully, I said, though I suspected we had very different definitions of what doing wonderfully would look like. Why don't we start by reviewing your current understanding of our major client accounts? For the next hour, I watched Sienna demonstrate exactly how unprepared she was for the role Glenn was handing her. She confused Morrison Hotels with Marriott, thought Lakefront Beverages was a startup rather than a century-old brewery, and suggested that Riverside Banking needed to quote crypto-friendly messaging, despite their target demographic being risk-averse professionals seeking traditional financial stability. Glenn sat through this display with the expression of a man who was willfully blind to obvious reality, occasionally nodding as if Sienna's suggestions made perfect sense instead of revealing fundamental misunderstandings about every aspect of our business. As the meeting concluded and Sienna returned to her desk, Glenn turned to me with satisfaction written across his face. "See," he said. "I told you she brings fresh perspectives. Sometimes experience can actually be a limitation when you're trying to innovate." I nodded politely, though inside I was calculating exactly how long it would take for those fresh perspectives to destroy everything I had built. More importantly, I was remembering the insurance policy I had quietly put in place 3 years earlier, the legal protection that Glenn had forgotten about, but that would soon become the most important document of both our careers. Glenn thought he was upgrading his leadership team. What he had actually done was hand me the perfect justification for the nuclear option I had hoped never to use. That evening, I sat in my Lincoln Park apartment, staring out at the city skyline while nursing a glass of wine I wasn't really tasting. The lights of downtown Chicago twinkled in the distance, and I could see the Meridian Creative Building among the cluster of towers that housed the city's most successful businesses. Somewhere in that building, Glenn was probably congratulating himself on his brilliant personnel decision, completely unaware that he had just triggered a chain of events that would destroy everything he thought he owned. I should have been devastated. 7 years of my life, countless sacrifices, missed dinners, and abandoned weekends, all reduced to a 2-week transition period and corporate euphemisms about fresh perspectives. Any normal person would have been furious, hurt, or at least deeply shaken by such a profound betrayal. But I wasn't feeling any of those things. Instead, I felt something much more dangerous: absolute clarity. Glenn thought he was disposing of an employee who had outlived her usefulness. What he had actually done was betray someone who possessed intimate knowledge of every weakness in his operation, every secret that kept his company profitable, and every relationship that generated revenue. More importantly, he had betrayed someone who held legal leverage he had completely forgotten about. I walked to my home office and opened the secure filing cabinet where I kept my most important documents. There, in a folder labeled Meridian Restructuring 2021, was the agreement that would change everything. I pulled out the contract and spread it across my desk, reading through clauses I had memorized but hadn't looked at in almost 2 years. 3 years ago, Meridian Creative had faced its most serious financial crisis. The Illinois Tourism Board had pulled their contract after a political scandal involving their previous director, and suddenly we were looking at a $3.8 million revenue shortfall with no clear path to recovery. 2 major clients had delayed their renewals pending the outcome of our financial situation, and 3 of our best employees had started exploring opportunities with competitors. Glenn had been on the verge of bankruptcy, both corporate and personal. He had leveraged his family's money to keep the agency afloat during its early years, and now he was facing the prospect of losing everything his grandfather had built. The bank was threatening to call in our business loans, our landlord was demanding 6 months' rent in advance, and our largest client was questioning whether we would still be in business to fulfill their contract. That's when I made an offer that saved Glenn's company and, unknown to him at the time, gave me complete control over his future. I had offered to personally guarantee the company's financial obligations using my own assets as collateral. At 32, I didn't have $3.8 million in liquid assets, but I had something almost as valuable: A family trust fund I had inherited from my grandmother, plus investment accounts I had been carefully building since college. Combined with my salary history and credit rating, I could secure the guarantees needed to keep Meridian operational. But I wasn't naive enough to take on that kind of financial risk without protecting myself. The arrangement I negotiated was complex, but elegant. I would guarantee the debt, preventing bankruptcy and keeping the company operational. In exchange, Glenn would restructure Meridian's ownership to reflect my investment in its survival. The legal documents were dense, filled with corporate language that most people find incomprehensible. Glenn had been so relieved to avoid bankruptcy that he had signed everything his lawyer put in front of him without reading the details carefully. His lawyer had explained the basic terms. Hannah guarantees the debt, the company avoids bankruptcy, everyone keeps their jobs. But Glenn hadn't bothered to understand the specific protections I had insisted upon. Those protections included a clause that had seemed like a formality at the time, but would soon become the most important paragraph of both our careers. If I was ever terminated from the company without documented cause, I had the right to call in the guaranteed debt immediately. And if that debt couldn't be satisfied within 45 days, the collateral I had negotiated would transfer to me. Me. The collateral wasn't just my personal financial guarantee. It was 51% of Meridian Creative's equity. Glenn had been so focused on saving his company that he had essentially signed away control of it without realizing what he was doing. For 3 years, that clause had sat dormant in our corporate documents, an insurance policy I hoped I would never need to activate. Now, as I read through the legal language that would soon turn Glenn's life upside down, I felt a calm satisfaction settle over me. I wouldn't need to engage in any kind of unethical behavior or corporate sabotage. I would simply exercise my legal rights under a contract he had willingly signed. I reached for my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in months. Emma Chen, the lawyer who had structured our agreement and who happened to be my law school roommate. Emma was now a partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious corporate law firms, and she had been the one to design the intricate legal framework that would soon destroy Glenn's world. "Emma," I said when she answered, "I need to discuss some corporate documents. Are you available for dinner tomorrow?" "Of course," she replied, curiosity evident in her voice. "Everything okay with Meridian?" "Actually," I said, looking out at the glittering city lights that had always inspired my best work, "everything is about to be perfect. The next 24 hours would be my last as Glenn's employee. After that, I would become something much more powerful, his partner, whether he wanted one or not. And if he chose to fight me rather than accept the new reality, I would become his owner." Ooh. Glenn thought he was getting rid of a problem. What he had actually done was wake up the one person who could take everything he had ever built. I closed the contract file and walked back to my window, wine glass in hand. Tomorrow would begin the most important negotiation of my career, and for the first time in 7 years, I would be negotiating from a position of absolute strength. Glenn Parker was about to learn that the most expensive mistake of his life wasn't hiring his girlfriend. It was underestimating mine. The next evening, Emma and I sat in a secluded corner booth at Alinea, the kind of restaurant where corporate deals were quietly discussed over molecular gastronomy and $300 bottles of wine. The dining room hummed with the low conversations of Chicago's business elite, and I knew that within weeks, some of these same people would be talking about what was about to happen at Meridian Creative. Emma spread the corporate documents across the white tablecloth between our appetizer courses, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed the contract she had drafted 3 years earlier. As one of Chicago's top corporate lawyers, she had structured dozens of complex business arrangements, but even she seemed impressed by the elegance of what we had created. "I remember this case vividly," she said, turning pages slowly while occasionally taking notes on her legal pad. Glenn was in serious trouble back then. The company was 3 weeks away from complete financial collapse, and he was looking at personal bankruptcy on top of corporate failure. I nodded, taking a sip of wine that cost more than most people's weekly salary. He was desperate. I've never seen someone so panicked about losing everything they thought they had built. "And you bailed him out," Emma continued, "with one of the most sophisticated debt-to-equity arrangements I've ever structured. Most people would have either loaned him the money with traditional terms or walked away entirely." "I believed in what we were building," I said. I knew the agency could succeed with proper financial stability and strategic management. I just didn't realize at the time that I was essentially providing both the stability and the management. Emma chuckled, adjusting her glasses as she found the specific clause we needed to discuss. Well, you certainly protected yourself. Look at this language here. She pointed to a section of dense legal text that most people would find incomprehensible. If you're terminated without documented cause, the guaranteed debt becomes immediately callable, and if it can't be satisfied within 45 days, the equity transfers to me, I finished, 51% of the company, plus the right to assume operational control and restructure the board of directors, Emma added. Hannah, with this language, if Glenn fires you without legitimate cause, you don't just get compensation, you get the company. I had known this, of course. I had insisted on these protections when we structured the deal, understanding even then that corporate loyalty was a fragile thing that could evaporate the moment it became inconvenient. But hearing Emma spell it out so clearly made the magnitude of my position sink in fully. The beauty of this arrangement, Emma continued, is that it's completely legitimate and legally bulletproof. Glenn signed this voluntarily, with full legal representation. His attorney reviewed every clause and recommended approval. But did Glenn understand what he was actually signing? Emma shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who had seen countless executives make expensive mistakes. That's not our concern. He had competent counsel, and the terms are clearly stated. Corporate executives are expected to understand the documents they sign, and ignorance isn't a legal defense when you're making binding agreements. We spent the next hour going over the mechanics of executing the clause. The process was straightforward but required precise timing. Emma would file a formal notice of debt acceleration with Meridian's registered agent, giving Glenn 45 days to satisfy the full amount of my guarantee. If he couldn't pay, which we both knew he couldn't, the equity would transfer automatically according to the terms we had established. What's the company worth now? Emma asked, pulling out her calculator and accessing financial databases on her tablet. I had been tracking this carefully over the past year, as any responsible part owner should. Conservative estimate based on current client contracts, annual revenue, and market comparables? About $12.8 million. That includes our client portfolio, proprietary methodologies, intellectual property, and physical assets. Emma whistled softly, making calculations. So we're talking about roughly $6.5 million in equity transfer, plus recovery of your original $3.8 million guarantee. Plus control of the company, I added. With 51% and the right to restructure operations, I could essentially force Glenn into a minority position, or buy him out entirely. Speaking of buying him out, Emma suggested, once you control the majority stake, you could make him an offer for his remaining shares. Given the circumstances, he might be motivated to accept a reasonable settlement rather than fight a battle he can't win. The idea was intoxicating. Not just revenge against Glenn for his betrayal, but complete transformation of the company I had built from the ground up. I could implement all the strategies I had been developing, hire the team I wanted, pursue the clients and projects that excited me most. I could build the agency I had always envisioned, without the limitations of Glenn's ego and increasingly poor judgment. There's one more critical element, Emma said, reviewing the final pages of the contract with the thoroughness that had made her one of Chicago's most successful corporate attorneys. The language here gives you the right to assume any executive position necessary to protect your investment. That means once you gain control, you could name yourself CEO, restructure the leadership team, or make any operational changes you deem appropriate. CEO. The title I had earned through 7 years of excellence but had never been offered because Glenn couldn't stand the idea of sharing power with someone he still saw as his employee, rather than his equal. How quickly can we move on this? I asked, feeling a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced since the early days of building Meridian's reputation. Emma checked her calendar and made notes about timing. I can file the papers tomorrow afternoon. Glenn will receive formal notice by end of business, and the 45-day clock starts immediately. And there's no way for him to challenge this legally? Not successfully, Emma said with the confidence of someone who had never lost a corporate case. The contract is airtight, and the termination trigger is clearly defined. As long as he fires you without documented performance issues, which it sounds like he's doing, you're completely protected. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a sense of calm determination settle over me like armor. Glenn thought he was upgrading his creative team and securing his relationship with Sienna. What he was actually doing was handing control of his life's work to the person who understood it better than anyone else in the world. "Do it," I said, raising my wine glass in a toast to the future. "File the papers tomorrow." Emma smiled, gathering the documents with the satisfaction of a lawyer who is about to execute a perfect legal strategy. "You know, Hannah, in 20 years of corporate law, I've never seen someone play the long game quite like this." "I didn't plan it this way," I replied honestly. "I just wanted to protect myself and ensure the company's success. Glenn chose to make this personal." "Well," Emma said, clinking her glass against mine, "here's to the most expensive girlfriend in Chicago corporate history." Tomorrow, Glenn Parker would learn that some decisions carry consequences far beyond what we can imagine. And I would begin the process of claiming everything I had spent 7 years building. The next morning, I arrived at Meridian Creative with a sense of purpose that felt almost electric. Everything looked exactly the same. The bustling reception area with its award-winning design, the familiar faces of colleagues who had no idea their world was about to shift dramatically, the gleaming company logo that Glenn had spent $80,000 redesigning just last year to reflect our evolved brand identity. But I wasn't the same person who had walked through these doors yesterday morning. 24 hours ago, I had been Hannah Walsh, creative director, preparing to train my replacement and quietly exit the company I had built. Today, I was Hannah Walsh, soon-to-be majority owner, preparing to reclaim everything that was rightfully mine. I settled into my morning routine, checking client emails and reviewing campaign metrics, while keeping one eye on Glenn's corner office. He was already in, probably planning how to announce Sienna's promotion to the team and crafting whatever corporate messaging would explain my sudden departure. He had no idea that in approximately 6 hours, his comfortable world of unchallenged authority would come crashing down around him. At 10:15 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Documents filed. Process server scheduled for 3 p.m. The die is cast." I smiled, sliding my phone back into my purse. Glenn was probably in his office right now, congratulating himself on his brilliant personnel decision. He might even be planning a celebratory dinner with Sienna, toasting their successful removal of the outdated creative director who had been standing in the way of their vision for the company's future. He had no idea that the foundation of his empire was about to crumble beneath his feet. I spent the morning in meetings with clients, conducting business as usual while internally counting down to the moment when everything would change. The Morrison Hotels team called to finalize details for next month's campaign presentation, and I found myself taking exceptionally detailed notes, not for Sienna's benefit, but because I would likely be the one managing that relationship for years to come. "Hannah," said Jennifer Morrison, the hotel chain's marketing director, "I have to tell you, working with you has been transformational for our brand. I hope we'll continue this partnership for many years." "I hope so too," I replied, meaning it more than she could possibly understand. "I'm very committed to seeing your brand reach its full potential." At lunch, I met with Tom Richardson from Lakefront Beverages at a small cafe near our office. He was their brand manager, and we had worked closely together for 3 years to rebuild their market position. Over salads and sandwiches, he brought up something that made my upcoming ownership transition even more satisfying. "I heard through the grapevine that there might be some changes happening at Meridian," he said, his expression concerned. "Please tell me you're not going anywhere." Word traveled fast in Chicago's business community. I wasn't surprised that news of my departure had already reached our clients, though I suspected the version they were hearing was quite different from the reality. "There are definitely some changes coming," I said carefully, "but I want you to know that regardless of what happens, I'm completely committed to the success of the Lakefront campaign and our ongoing partnership." Tom looked relieved. "Good, because honestly, Hannah, your strategic vision is the reason we've seen such incredible growth. I can't imagine working with anyone else on something this important." This was exactly what I had expected. The relationships I had built over 7 years weren't just professional contacts. They were partnerships based on trust, proven results, and deep understanding of each client's unique challenges. Sienna might be able to smile her way through a presentation, but she couldn't replicate the expertise and relationship history that my clients valued most. "I appreciate that confidence," I said. "And I want you to know that whatever changes occur at Meridian, I'll make sure the lakefront account receives the attention and expertise it deserves." Tom studied my face, clearly picking up on subtext he couldn't quite identify. "Hannah, is everything okay? You seem different today. More confident, if that's possible." I was different today. Yesterday I had been an employee facing termination. Today I was a strategist preparing to claim control of my destiny. "Everything's more than okay," I assured him. "Actually, I think everything is about to become much better than okay." After lunch, I returned to the office and settled in to wait. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness as I watched Glenn move through his usual routine. Client calls, team meetings, the kind of high-level strategizing that mostly involved other people implementing ideas he took credit for. At 2:55 p.m., I saw a man in a dark suit step off the elevator and approach our reception desk. He was carrying a leather portfolio and had the professional demeanor of someone who delivered important documents for a living. Our receptionist, Jody, spoke with him briefly before pointing toward Glenn's corner office. The process server had arrived. I watched through the glass partition as the man knocked on Glenn's door, waited for permission to enter, then disappeared inside. The conversation was brief, maybe 4 minutes, before the man emerged and walked back toward the elevators, with the satisfied air of someone who had completed an unpleasant but necessary task. Glenn's office remained quiet for several long minutes. Then, through the glass wall that separated his office from the main workspace, I saw him pick up his phone and dial with the rapid, agitated movements of someone whose world had just shifted dramatically. His lawyer, I assumed. The first call anyone makes when they're served with legal papers they don't understand. 25 minutes later, Glenn emerged from his office, his face flushed and his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. He looked around the workspace with the confused expression of someone whose reality had just been fundamentally altered, as if he was seeing his own company for the first time. His eyes found mine through my office window, and for a moment we stared at each other across the 40 feet of open space that separated us. I could see the questions forming in his mind, the dawning realization that this wasn't some random legal complication or bureaucratic mistake. I gave him a small, professional smile, and returned to my computer screen as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything extraordinary had happened. The 45-day countdown had begun, and Glenn Parker was about to learn that the most dangerous person in any organization isn't the enemy you can see coming. It's the ally you never bothered to understand. In 45 days, I would own his company, unless, of course, he could find $3.8 million in cash to pay off a debt he had forgotten existed. Something told me that was going to be a problem. By 4:30 p.m., Glenn still hadn't emerged from his office to confront me about the legal papers he'd been served. Through his glass wall, I could see him pacing behind his desk with his phone pressed to his ear, occasionally running his hands through his hair in the gesture I recognized as his tell for extreme stress and panic. I decided not to wait for him to summon me. Instead, I gathered my files, knocked on his doorframe, and entered his office with the same professional demeanor I had maintained for 7 years. "Do you have a minute to discuss the transition timeline?" I asked, settling into one of the leather chairs facing his desk, as if this were just another routine meeting. Glenn ended his phone call abruptly and stared at me with the expression of a man who had just realized he was swimming in shark-infested waters. The legal documents were spread across his normally pristine desk-like evidence at a crime scene, and I could see that he had been making frantic notes in the margins. "Hannah," he began, his voice carefully controlled but lacking its usual confidence. "My lawyer says you filed some kind of debt collection notice against the company." "That's correct," I replied calmly, crossing my legs and leaning back in my chair. "I'm exercising my rights under our 2021 corporate restructuring agreement." Glenn's face went through several color changes as he processed my words. "What 2021 agreement? What rights?" "Hannah?" I have no idea what you're talking about. I felt a flash of satisfaction mixed with genuine disbelief. He really had signed those documents without understanding what they contained. The man who prided himself on being a savvy businessman had essentially signed away his company 3 years ago and completely forgotten about it. The agreement where I personally guaranteed Meridian's financial obligations to prevent bankruptcy, I explained patiently, as if I were talking to a particularly slow intern. In exchange for certain protections, including the right to call that debt if I'm terminated without documented cause. Glenn grabbed the legal papers and scanned them frantically, his eyes widening as he began to understand the magnitude of his situation. But that was 3 years ago. The company is profitable now, we're not in crisis anymore. You're absolutely right, I agreed. The company is very profitable. Thanks largely to my strategic vision and client relationships over the past 7 years. But the debt guarantee remains in effect until the original obligations are satisfied, which they haven't been. I don't understand, Glenn said, his voice rising slightly. Are you saying you want your money back? We can work out a payment plan, restructure the terms. I'm saying the debt is now due in full, within 45 days, as specified in our agreement. Glenn's hands were shaking slightly as he flipped through the pages, clearly seeing the legal language for the first time despite having signed it years earlier. $3.8 million in 45 days? Hannah, you know that's impossible. The company doesn't have that kind of liquid capital. I know, I said simply, my voice steady and matter-of-fact. The silence stretched between us as Glenn began to grasp the position he had unknowingly put himself in. I could see his mind racing, trying to find an escape route from a trap he had set for himself through his own carelessness and arrogance. What do you want? He asked finally, his voice quieter now, defeated. I want what's mine, I replied without hesitation. The equity position I negotiated when I saved your company from bankruptcy. Glenn pulled out the original contract with trembling hands and began reading it more carefully than he had when he signed it. His face grew progressively paler as he reached the sections Emma had crafted so carefully. 51%, he whispered, staring at the page as if the words might change if he looked at them long enough. You get 51% if I can't pay the debt. Plus the right to assume operational control and restructure the leadership team, I added helpfully, though I could see he was reading that clause himself. Glenn looked up from the papers with the expression of a man who had just realized he'd been playing checkers while his opponent was playing chess. This was planned. You knew this would happen when you made me sign this. I planned for the possibility that you might make poor decisions, I corrected. I hoped you wouldn't. I hoped we could continue building Meridian together as true partners. But you chose to treat me as disposable, to replace me with your girlfriend, simply because she makes you feel young again. Glenn leaned back in his chair, the weight of his situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. Hannah, come on, we can fix this. You can keep your job, forget about Sienna, we'll restructure your role. No, I said, cutting him off with quiet finality. You made your choice yesterday when you decided I wasn't valuable enough to keep. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. Glenn ran his hands through his hair again, his carefully maintained executive composure completely shattered. What happens now? Now you have 45 days to find $3.8 million, I said, standing to leave. Or you can negotiate an alternative arrangement. What kind of alternative arrangement? I paused at the door, my hand on the handle, and turned back to face him. That depends on how reasonable you want to be about recognizing my actual contribution to this company's success. Glenn's eyes were wide, with something approaching panic. Hannah, please, let's talk about this. There has to be a solution that works for everyone. There is, I agreed. But it's not the solution you were hoping for when you decided to fire me yesterday. As I left his office, I could see the other employees pretending not to stare at the closed-door meeting they had all witnessed. Word would spread quickly that something significant was happening, though they wouldn't understand what until it was too late for Glenn to control the narrative. I returned to my office and began drafting detailed transition documents, not for Sienna but for myself. In 45 days, I would likely be running Meridian Creative, and I wanted to be prepared to hit the ground running with a complete understanding of every aspect of our operations. The game had begun, and Glenn was already several moves behind. More importantly, he was playing by rules he didn't understand against an opponent who had written those rules specifically to protect herself from exactly the kind of betrayal he had just committed. Glenn thought he was getting rid of a problem employee. What he had actually done was trigger a legal mechanism that would transfer control of his life's work to the person who understood it better than anyone else in the world. The irony was almost perfect. In trying to replace me, Glenn had instead made me his boss. Hell. The next morning brought a level of tension to the office that was almost palpable. Glenn had clearly spent the night on emergency calls with lawyers and financial advisors, trying to find a way out of the legal maze he had unknowingly constructed for himself 3 years earlier. I arrived at my usual time, 7:45 a.m., and found Glenn already in his office with 3 people in expensive suits. Through his glass wall I could see documents spread across his conference table, laptops displaying what looked like financial projections, and the kind of intense, hushed conversations that only happen when someone's entire world is collapsing. His crisis management team, I realized. The cavalry he had called in to save him from the consequences of his own arrogance and carelessness. I settled into my morning routine, reviewing client emails and preparing for what I knew would be an interesting day, while keeping one eye on the emergency session happening 20 feet away. Around 8:30 a.m., one of the suited figures, clearly a lawyer based on his demeanor and the way he handled the legal documents, emerged from Glenn's office and approached mine. "Ms. Walsh?" he said, knocking on my open door with the cautious politeness of someone navigating a minefield. "I'm John Morrison from Morrison, Hayes & Associates. I represent Meridian Creative. Could I have a few minutes of your time?" "Of course," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk while noting the irony that his last name was the same as our hotel client. Though I should mention that I am represented by Emma Chen at Chen & Partners. Morrison nodded, settling into the chair with the careful movements of someone who clearly understood he was dealing with a much more sophisticated situation than his client had initially described. "I understand you filed a debt acceleration notice against the company." "That's correct. Mr. Parker is hoping we can reach some kind of accommodation that works for all parties involved." I leaned back in my chair, studying Morrison's face. He had the tired, slightly exasperated look of a competent lawyer who had been briefed on a situation that made no sense from his client's perspective, because his client had made decisions without understanding their legal implications. "What kind of accommodation are you envisioning?" "Well," Morrison said carefully, pulling out a legal pad covered with notes, "perhaps we could restructure the original agreement, extend the payment timeline, adjust the interest terms, maybe find a way to convert some of the debt to equity in a more gradual fashion." "The original agreement already specifies the terms for this exact situation," I replied calmly. "I'm simply following the contract as written and signed." Morrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that he was dealing with someone who had thought this through much more carefully than his client had. "Ms. Walsh, surely we can find a solution that doesn't involve such drastic consequences for the company's operations?" I almost felt sorry for him. Morrison was obviously a skilled corporate lawyer stuck representing a client who had made an incompetent decision years earlier and was now facing the entirely predictable consequences. "Mr. Morrison," I said, "I'm not the one who created this situation. Your client signed a legally binding agreement after receiving competent legal counsel. If he's unhappy with the consequences, perhaps he should have read the contract more carefully before signing it. But certainly you understand that forcing a debt payment of this magnitude could seriously damage the company's operations, potentially affecting dozens of employees and client relationships." "Yes," I interrupted, "I understand that perfectly. I also understand that Mr. Parker was perfectly willing to damage the company's operations yesterday, when he decided to fire the person who built most of those operations and client relationships." Morrison was quiet for a moment, clearly recognizing that this wasn't a simple financial dispute, but a much more complex situation involving betrayal, poor judgment, and consequences that his client hadn't anticipated. "What would it take to resolve this situation?" he asked finally. "That depends entirely on what Mr. Parker is prepared to offer," I said. "But I should be clear. I'm not interested in returning to my previous position as an employee. That ship sailed yesterday when he chose to replace me with his girlfriend." Morrison took notes, probably realizing that he needed to report back to Glenn that this wasn't going to be resolved with simple financial negotiations or legal maneuvering. After Morrison left my office, I called Emma to update her on the morning's developments. "They're already trying to negotiate," I told her. Glenn brought in outside counsel from Morrison Hayes. "John Morrison? He's good, but not that good," Emma said with the confidence of someone who had faced him in court before. "Did he try the usual approaches? Extended payment plans? Restructured terms?" "All of the above. I told him we're following the contract as written." "Perfect. Sarah, I should warn you, they're probably going to come at this from multiple angles over the next few days. They might challenge the contract's enforceability, claim you're acting in bad faith, maybe even suggest that the termination was for cause rather than the arbitrary decision we both know it was." "Let them try," I said. "I have 7 years of performance reviews, client testimonials, and documented achievements. If they want to claim I was terminated for cause, they'll need to explain why Glenn spent yesterday praising my work while asking me to train my replacement." "Exactly. Plus," Emma continued, "the beauty of this contract is that it doesn't matter why they want to terminate you. The only question is whether they can pay the debt when called. Everything else is irrelevant." I spent the rest of the morning watching Glenn's crisis team work frantically to find solutions that didn't exist. Through his glass wall, I could see them making phone calls, reviewing financial documents, and having the kind of intense discussions that only happen when intelligent people realize they're dealing with an impossible situation. Around 11 a.m., I received a call that made my day even more interesting. It was Jennifer Morrison from Morrison Hotels, our largest client. "Hannah," she said, her voice concerned, "I'm hearing some disturbing rumors about changes at Meridian. Please tell me you're not leaving." "There are definitely some significant changes happening," I said carefully. "But I want you to assure you that regardless of what occurs, I'm completely committed to the success of our partnership and the upcoming campaign launch." "Good, because I have to be honest. Your strategic vision and account management are the primary reasons we've had such incredible results. I can't imagine working with anyone else on something this important to our brand." This was exactly what I had expected, and it was probably being repeated by every major client as word of my departure spread through Chicago's business community. The relationships I had built weren't just professional contacts, they were partnerships based on trust, proven results, and deep understanding of each client's unique challenges and goals. "I appreciate that confidence," I said, "and I want you to know that whatever changes occur at Meridian, our partnership will continue to receive the attention and expertise it deserves." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "Hannah, can I ask what's really going on? This doesn't sound like a normal transition." "Let's just say," I replied carefully, "that some people are about to learn the difference between owning a company and actually running it." By lunchtime, Glenn's legal team was still huddled in his office, probably realizing that they were dealing with a contract so airtight that their only hope was to convince me to accept terms more favorable than what I had already negotiated for myself. The 45-day countdown was in effect, and Glenn Parker was discovering that the most expensive decision of his life wasn't hiring his girlfriend. It was underestimating the woman he thought he could simply discard. Over the next week, I watched with fascination as Glenn's perfectly ordered world began to unravel thread by thread. The irony was exquisite. For 2 weeks, I was supposed to be training Sienna to take over my responsibilities, but instead I had a front-row seat to observe the systematic collapse of everything Glenn thought he controlled. Sienna, bless her heart, was completely oblivious to the legal earthquake happening around her. She approached her new role with the kind of eager enthusiasm that comes from never having failed at anything difficult, mainly because she'd never attempted anything difficult. While Glenn huddled with lawyers and frantically searched for emergency funding, Sienna was busy redecorating my office and planning what she called creative innovation sessions. "Hannah," she said on Thursday morning, settling into my office with a notebook covered in colorful sticky tabs, "I've been thinking about how we can modernize our approach to client relationships. What if we started doing all our presentations through Instagram stories? And maybe we could get some of our clients to do TikTok challenges." I looked up from the Morrison Hotels renewal strategy I was reviewing, the $2.8 million contract that would likely be mine to manage in a few weeks. "That's an interesting idea, Sienna. Have you discussed this with the Morrison Hotels team?" They might have thoughts about whether TikTok challenges align with their brand positioning. Sienna's face brightened with the confidence of someone who had never had an idea challenged by actual market research. Oh, I'm sure they'll love it once they see how much engagement we can generate. Everyone wants to go viral, right? I managed not to laugh. Morrison Hotel's target demographic was creative professionals in their 30s and 40s who valued sophisticated experiences and authentic environments. The idea of asking them to participate in TikTok challenges was so fundamentally misaligned with their brand identity that it would probably end the relationship immediately. You should definitely present that to them, I said encouragingly. I'm sure they'll have strong reactions. While Sienna planned her social media revolution, Glenn's situation was becoming more desperate by the day. Through his glass wall, I could see him taking increasingly frantic phone calls, probably reaching out to every potential investor, lender, or financial connection he had ever cultivated. The problem was simple. Meridian Creative was successful, but like most agencies, our success was built on client relationships and intellectual capital rather than liquid assets. We had steady cash flow, valuable contracts, and a strong market position, but we didn't have $3.8 million sitting in a checking account. That kind of money was tied up in operations, salaries, office space, and the kind of long-term investments that make a company profitable over time. On Friday afternoon, I received a call that confirmed what I had been expecting. It was Tom Richardson from Lakefront Beverages, and his voice carried the kind of concern that comes from hearing disturbing rumors about your most important vendor. Hannah, he said without preamble, I'm getting some conflicting information about what's happening at Meridian. Our contact at Morrison Hotels mentioned that there might be some kind of management transition, but then I heard from someone at Riverside Banking that you might be leaving entirely. Can you help me understand what's actually going on? This was the moment I had been preparing for. The moment when Glenn's decision to fire me would start affecting the client relationships that generated our revenue. There are definitely some significant changes happening, I said carefully, but I want to assure you that the Lakefront campaign remains my top priority, regardless of what structural changes occur at the agency level. Hannah, I need to be direct with you, Tom said. Your strategic vision is the reason we've seen such incredible results over the past 3 years. If you're leaving Meridian, we need to discuss whether our contract should follow you. I felt a surge of satisfaction. This was exactly what I had hoped would happen, and exactly what Glenn had been too arrogant to anticipate. I appreciate that confidence more than you know, I replied. And I want you to know that regardless of what title appears on my business card, I'm personally committed to seeing the Lakefront brand reach its full potential. Tom was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to read between the lines. Hannah, are you telling me that you might be staying at Meridian in a different capacity? Let's just say, I said, that reports of my departure may have been greatly exaggerated. After I hung up, I made similar calls to 3 other major clients, essentially conducting a very diplomatic form of client retention that would ensure our biggest accounts remained secure, regardless of what happened with Glenn's desperate attempts to find emergency funding. By Monday of the second week, the cracks in Glenn's facade were becoming impossible to hide. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who wasn't sleeping well, and his perfectly groomed appearance was showing signs of strain. His hair was less perfectly styled, his ties weren't as precisely knotted, and he had developed a nervous habit of checking his phone constantly for updates from his financial advisors. The other employees were starting to notice. I could see them whispering in small groups, speculating about the closed-door meetings and tense phone calls that had become Glenn's constant companions. Our office manager, Jody, approached me with the kind of careful concern that suggested she was hoping I had answers that would reassure her about job security. Hannah, she said quietly, is everything okay with the company? Glenn seems really stressed, and there have been so many lawyers and financial people coming and going. There are some complicated business matters being worked out, I said truthfully. But I don't think you need to worry about your position. The company's client relationships and operational needs haven't changed. Jody looked relieved, but still concerned. It's just that we've all heard rumors about changes in leadership, and with you training Sienna. Sometimes changes in leadership aren't what they initially appear to be, I said, giving her what I hoped was a reassuring smile. I think things will become much clearer in the next few weeks. What I didn't tell Jody was that I had been quietly reaching out to our most talented employees, having discreet conversations about their long-term career goals, and ensuring they understood that whatever changes occurred at Meridian, their skills and contributions would continue to be valued. Because in a few weeks, when the dust settled, I wanted to make sure that the team I had helped build would be ready to work for their new CEO, me. Glenn had thought he was upgrading his leadership team. What he had actually done was trigger a countdown timer on his own career while handing control of everything he had built to the person who understood it better than anyone else. The beautiful irony was that he was going to train me to be his boss, and he didn't even realize it yet. Monday morning of my third week brought the confrontation I had been anticipating. Glenn stormed into the office at 7:30 a.m., his face flushed and his hair disheveled in a way that suggested he'd spent another sleepless night on the phone with financial advisors who were running out of options to offer him. I was already at my desk reviewing the quarterly reports that would soon become very important for my transition to ownership, when Glenn appeared in my doorway with the desperate look of a man who had finally realized he was drowning. "Hannah," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "we need to talk. Conference room. Now." I gathered my files slowly, noting how the other employees tried not to stare, as Glenn and I walked toward the glass-walled conference room where this entire situation had begun 2 weeks earlier. Through the transparent walls, I could see Sienna, at what used to be my desk, scrolling through her phone while surrounded by color-coded notebooks and motivational sticky notes. Glenn closed the conference room door with more force than necessary, and turned to face me with the expression of a man who had just realized he'd been playing chess while his opponent was playing three-dimensional strategy. "My financial advisors have run the numbers," he began without preamble. $3.8 million in liquid assets. "Hannah, you know that's impossible for us to generate in the time frame you're demanding." "I'm not demanding anything," I replied calmly, settling into my chair with the composure of someone who held all the cards. "I'm simply exercising my legal rights under an agreement you signed voluntarily 3 years ago." Glenn slammed a stack of papers onto the conference table. Financial statements, loan applications, investment proposals. "I've contacted every bank, every investor, every financial institution in Chicago. No one will approve emergency funding of this magnitude for a company that's essentially losing its core operational leadership." I felt a surge of satisfaction. Glenn was finally beginning to understand the position he had put himself in, not just the legal trap he'd signed 3 years ago, but the practical reality that firing me had undermined the very foundation of our company's value. "That does seem like a challenging situation," I agreed sympathetically. "Don't play games with me," Glenn snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "You know exactly what you're doing. This was planned from the beginning, wasn't it? You've been waiting for an excuse to trigger this clause." "I planned for the possibility that you might make poor decisions," I corrected. "I hoped you wouldn't. I hoped we could continue building Meridian together as true partners. But you chose to replace me with someone whose primary qualification is making you feel young again." Glenn's face went through several color changes as the full magnitude of his situation sank in. "Hannah, come on. We can work this out. I'll give you a promotion, make you a partner, increase your equity stake." "Glenn," I interrupted gently, "you fired me. You can't give me a promotion after you've already terminated my employment. The legal process is already in motion." "Then stop it," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Call your lawyer. Withdraw the debt acceleration. We'll negotiate new terms." "Why would I do that?" I asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. "You've made it very clear that you don't value my contributions. You've decided that Sienna can do my job better than I can. Why would I want to stay in a situation where my expertise isn't appreciated?" Glenn was quiet for a long moment, staring at the financial documents spread across the table as if they might magically transform into a solution. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want what's mine," I said simply. "The equity position I negotiated when I saved your company from bankruptcy. The control I should have had all along, given that I've been essentially running operations for the past 3 years." 51%, Glenn whispered, reading from the contract for what was probably the 100th time since he'd been served. "You get 51% of my company." "Your company?" I raised an eyebrow. "Glenn, I've generated more revenue for Meridian than you have. I've managed more client relationships, developed more successful campaigns, and built more of our institutional knowledge. At what point does it stop being your company and start being ours? Glenn leaned back in his chair, the weight of his situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. This isn't just about the money, is it? This is about revenge. This isn't about revenge at all, I replied honestly. Revenge would be watching you fail and walking away. This is about justice. You tried to discard me like I was nothing. Now you get to learn what Meridian Creative is actually worth without me. So what happens now? Glenn asked, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Now you have 3 weeks to find $3.8 million, I said, standing to leave. Or you can accept the reality that I'm about to become your business partner, whether you like it or not. Glenn's eyes widened with something approaching panic. Hannah, please. There has to be another way. I'll fire Sienna, I'll restructure the entire company, I'll do whatever you want. 3 weeks ago that might have been enough, I said, pausing at the door. But you made your choice. You decided I was disposable. Now you get to live with the consequences of that decision. As I left the conference room, I could see Glenn through the glass wall, slumped in his chair with his head in his hands. The man who had walked into work this morning as the undisputed CEO of Meridian Creative was slowly realizing that in 3 weeks, he would likely be working for me. The other employees pretended not to stare as I walked back to my office, but I could feel the tension in the air. Word was spreading that something major was happening, though they wouldn't understand what until it was too late for Glenn to control the narrative. I settled back at my desk and opened my laptop to review the transition plans I'd been developing. In 3 weeks, I would likely be running Meridian Creative, and I wanted to be prepared to hit the ground running with a complete understanding of every aspect of our operations. Glenn had thought he was getting rid of a problem employee. What he had actually done was trigger a legal mechanism that would transfer control of his life's work to the person who understood it better than anyone else in the world. The countdown was at 21 days, and Glenn Parker was finally beginning to understand that the most expensive mistake of his life wasn't hiring his girlfriend. It was underestimating the woman he thought he could simply replace. I opened my calendar and began scheduling meetings with our key clients. It was time to ensure a smooth transition of leadership, and I wanted everyone to understand that Meridian's best days were still ahead of us. Under new management, of course. That afternoon brought the moment I had been waiting for, the full revelation of just how completely Glenn had trapped himself. At 2:30 p.m., he emerged from his office and approached mine with the hollow-eyed look of someone who had just finished a conversation that changed everything. Hannah, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I need to understand something. When you structured that debt agreement 3 years ago, did you know this could happen? I looked up from the client retention strategy I was developing, the plan that would ensure our biggest accounts remained stable during the ownership transition. Did I know what could happen? This, Glenn said, gesturing helplessly at the legal documents in his hand. The debt acceleration, the equity transfer, all of it. Did you plan for me to fire you so you could take over my company? I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. Glenn looked like he had aged 5 years in the past 3 weeks. His usual confidence had been replaced by the desperate confusion of someone who had just realized he'd been playing a game without understanding the rules. Glenn, I said carefully, I planned for the possibility that our partnership might end badly. I never hoped it would. I thought we were building something together that would benefit both of us for years to come. But you knew, he insisted. You knew that if you were ever fired, you could take control of the company. I knew that if I was ever fired without cause, I would be protected, I confirmed. That's what insurance policies are for, protection against unlikely but catastrophic events. Glenn stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the exact moment when the full magnitude of his situation crystallized in his mind. My lawyer says the contract is airtight. He says there's no legal basis to challenge it, no procedural errors, no grounds for appeal. Your lawyer is correct. He also says, Glenn continued, his voice growing smaller with each word, that even if I could somehow raise the money to pay off the debt, you could simply quit and start a competing agency with all our clients, since most of our contracts have personal service clauses tied to your involvement. I had been wondering when Glenn would realize this aspect of his predicament. The relationships I had built over 7 years weren't just professional contacts. They were partnerships that many clients had specifically structured around my continued involvement in their accounts. That's also correct, I said, though I should point out that I have no intention of starting a competing agency. I prefer to build on existing foundations rather than starting from scratch. Glenn sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk, the weight of his situation finally settling on him completely. So either way, I lose the company. Either you take it over through the debt transfer, or you walk away and take most of our clients with you. Those are certainly 2 possible outcomes, I agreed. What's the third option? Glenn asked, though his voice suggested he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. The third option is that you accept the reality of our new partnership and work with me to ensure a smooth transition that protects the company we've both invested in. Glenn's laugh was bitter and hollow. Partnership? You mean I get to work for you? You get to work with me, I corrected. 49% ownership is still substantial. You'd still have significant influence over strategic decisions and a meaningful stake in the company's success. But you'd be the majority owner. You'd have final authority. Yes, I said simply. Just like you've had final authority for the past 7 years, even though I've been doing most of the work that generated our success. Glenn fell silent, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline that had once represented his domain as a successful agency owner. I could see him processing the reversal of fortune that was about to transform him from my boss into my business partner, and junior partner at that. I talked to Jennifer Morrison this morning, he said finally. From Morrison Hotels. I felt a flutter of anticipation. What did she say? She wanted to confirm that you'd be personally involved in their upcoming campaign launch. When I told her about the leadership transition, she made it very clear that their continued partnership depends on your direct involvement. Glenn's voice was flat, defeated. She actually used the phrase, non-negotiable requirement. This was exactly what I had expected, but hearing it confirmed was still satisfying. Jennifer and I have worked closely together for 5 years. We've built the kind of professional relationship that's based on trust and proven results. Tom Richardson called an hour later, Glenn continued. Same message. Lakefront Beverages considers you essential to their account. Then the Illinois Tourism Board. Then Riverside Banking. He looked up at me with something approaching awe. Hannah, they're not just loyal to you. They're specifically contracting for your services. That tends to happen when you consistently deliver exceptional results and build genuine partnerships instead of just processing transactions. Glenn shook his head slowly. I never realized how much of our client base was personally tied to you rather than the agency brand. That's because you've spent the past few years taking credit for work you didn't do and relationships you didn't build, I said, though my voice remained professional rather than accusatory. It's easier to maintain the illusion of leadership when someone else is doing the actual leading. So what happens now? Glenn asked. Assuming I can't raise the money, which we both know I can't, what does this transition actually look like? I pulled out a folder I had been preparing for exactly this conversation. I've been developing a restructuring plan that would ensure continuity for our clients, job security for our employees, and a strategic vision that builds on our existing strengths. Glenn accepted the folder with the resignation of someone who no longer had any choice in the matter. You're gonna fire me, aren't you? Glenn, I said, leaning forward slightly. I'm going to do something you apparently never considered doing with me. I'm going to evaluate your contributions objectively and find the role where you can add the most value to our shared success. He opened the folder and began reading, his expression shifting from resignation to surprise as he saw the detailed transition plan I had developed. Creative Director, he read aloud. You want me to be Creative Director? You're actually quite good at the creative aspects of our business, I said honestly. Your problem has never been lack of creative vision. Your problem has been thinking that creative vision alone was sufficient to run a successful agency. Glenn looked up from the documents with an expression I couldn't quite read. You're not going to humiliate me. Why would I humiliate you? That would be bad for business, bad for morale, and bad for our clients. I'm going to put you in a position where you can succeed while ensuring that the company continues to thrive. For the first time in 3 weeks, Glenn's expression showed something other than panic or desperation. "Hannah," he said quietly, "I think I'm beginning to understand why our clients trust you more than they trust me." "It's simple," I replied. "I focus on what's best for the work, rather than what's best for my ego." Glenn closed the folder and stood to leave, then paused at the door. "When does this transition become official?" 18 days, I said, "unless you can find $3.8 million between now and then." As Glenn left my office, I could see Sienna through the glass partition, still arranging her desk accessories and apparently oblivious to the fact that her tenure as creative director was about to be the shortest in corporate history. In 18 days, I would walk into this office as the CEO of Meridian Creative, and Glenn Parker would learn that sometimes the best revenge is simply proving you never needed them to be in charge to begin with. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange sort of suspended animation. Glenn moved through the office like a ghost of his former self, going through the motions of leadership, while knowing that each day brought him closer to losing everything he thought he owned. His expensive suits hung looser on his frame, and the confident swagger that had once defined his presence had been replaced by the careful movements of someone trying not to shatter what remained of his world. Sienna, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the tectonic shifts happening around her. She continued her enthusiastic preparations for a role she would never truly hold, creating PowerPoint presentations about millennial marketing strategies, and scheduling meetings with clients who had already made it clear they wouldn't work with anyone but me. I watched it all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and professional detachment. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about consequences. Glenn had made his choice when he decided I was disposable, and now he was learning that some decisions carry a price higher than anticipated. On Tuesday of the final week, Glenn made one last desperate attempt to change the outcome. He appeared in my office doorway at 6 p.m., after most of the staff had gone home, carrying a bottle of expensive whiskey and wearing the expression of a man about to beg for his life. "Hannah," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk without invitation. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, about the mistakes I made." I looked up from the transition timeline I was finalizing. "What kinds of mistakes?" "All of them," Glenn said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey, despite the fact that I hadn't asked for one. "Firing you was the stupidest decision I've ever made. Promoting Sienna was arrogance. Not reading that contract carefully enough was criminal negligence. I accepted the glass he offered but didn't drink. Those are certainly accurate assessments." "There has to be something I can offer you," Glenn continued, his voice carrying the desperation of someone making a final plea. "Some arrangement that doesn't involve me losing control of everything I've built." "Glenn," I said gently, "you lost control of everything you built the moment you signed that contract 3 years ago. You just didn't realize it until now." He drained his whiskey in one gulp and refilled the glass immediately. "I could make you CEO while keeping majority ownership. We could restructure the debt as a long-term loan with reasonable payments. I could give you complete operational control." "Why would I accept a long-term loan when I can own the company outright in 6 days?" I asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. Glenn was quiet for a long moment, staring into his whiskey as if it might contain answers. "Because somewhere in the past 7 years I thought we were friends." The admission hung in the air between us, and for a moment I felt something that might have been regret. Not regret for what I was doing. Glenn had earned every consequence he was facing, but regret for what we could have been if he had valued partnership over control. "We were friends," I said finally. "That's what made your decision to fire me so disappointing. Friends don't dispose of each other when they become inconvenient." Glenn finished his second whiskey and stood to leave, recognizing that his final appeal had failed. 6 days, he said, as much to himself as to me. 6 days, I confirmed. As he reached the door, Glenn turned back one last time. "Hannah, when this is over, what happens to Sienna?" I had been wondering when he would ask about her. "That depends on whether she's genuinely interested in learning the business, or just interested in the title and the relationship with you." Glenn nodded slowly. "She's not ready for this level of responsibility." "No," I agreed, "she's not. But that was your decision to make, and you made it." After Glenn left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the Chicago skyline that would soon represent my domain rather than his. In 6 days, I would walk into Meridian Creative as its new CEO, and the 7-year journey from grateful employee to majority owner would be complete. Glenn had thought he was upgrading his team. Instead, he had orchestrated the most comprehensive transfer of power in the agency's history. And the beautiful irony was that he had done it all to himself. Friday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. In 72 hours, the 45-day deadline would expire, and if Glenn couldn't produce $3.8 million in cash, 51% of Meridian Creative would automatically transfer to me. The legal machinery was already in motion, with Emma's firm prepared to execute the ownership transfer the moment the deadline passed. I arrived at the office early, as had become my habit during these final weeks, and found Glenn already there. He sat in his corner office, surrounded by boxes that suggested he was preparing for the transition, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Through the glass wall, I could see him on the phone, probably making one final round of calls to investors who had already turned him down. At 10 a.m., Glenn emerged from his office and walked directly to mine. His appearance was immaculate again, hair perfectly styled, suit pressed, tie knotted with precision, as if he had decided to face his defeat with whatever dignity he could muster. "Hannah," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the formal composure of someone delivering a prepared statement. "I need to discuss the terms of our transition." I closed my laptop and gave him my full attention. "What terms did you have in mind?" Glenn placed a manila folder on my desk. "I've been working with my lawyers to develop a proposal that might work for both of us." I opened the folder, curious to see what last-minute arrangement Glenn thought he could offer that would be more attractive than simply taking control of his company. "You become CEO immediately," Glenn began, reading from notes as I reviewed his proposal. "I transition to chairman of the board, with equity reduced to 40%. We restructure the debt as a 5-year term loan with reasonable payments." I looked up from the documents. "Glenn, this proposal would require me to give up 11% of the equity I'm legally entitled to in 3 days, in exchange for a job title I'm already going to receive anyway. But it would provide stability," Glenn argued. "A planned transition instead of what amounts to a hostile takeover. Better for employee morale, better for client relationships." "Our client relationships are already stable," I pointed out. "I've spent the past month ensuring that every major account understands the transition and feels confident about continuity of service." Glenn's shoulders slumped slightly. "Hannah, I'm trying to find a way to salvage something from this situation. Some arrangement that doesn't completely destroy everything I've worked for." I studied his face, seeing desperation mixed with a kind of resigned dignity. "Glenn, what you worked for isn't being destroyed. It's being transferred to someone who can manage it more effectively." "To someone who earned it," he said quietly. The admission surprised me. In all our conversations over the past 6 weeks, Glenn had never explicitly acknowledged that I had earned the right to lead the company we had built together. "Yes," I agreed. "To someone who earned it." Glenn was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the city skyline. "If I accept the inevitable, if I let the equity transfer happen as scheduled, what assurances do I have about my role in the company going forward?" I had been expecting this question and had prepared a thoughtful answer. "You have my word that your transition will be handled professionally, and that your new role will utilize your actual strengths rather than simply humiliating you." "Your word," Glenn repeated as if testing the weight of that commitment. "My word," I confirmed. "Which, as you've learned over the past 7 years, is considerably more reliable than yours." Glenn almost smiled at that, a rueful acknowledgement of the truth we both understood. "What happens to Sienna?" "Sienna will have the opportunity to learn the business properly, starting in an appropriate entry-level position. If she's genuinely committed to building expertise rather than just holding a title, she could have a future here. And if she's not, then she'll find herself in the same position as any other employee who isn't adding value to our client's success." Glenn nodded slowly, recognizing that this was probably the best outcome he could hope for given the circumstances he had created. 72 hours, he said, standing to leave. 72 hours, I confirmed. As Glenn reached the door, he turned back one final time. "Hannah, for what it's worth, I think you'll be a better CEO than I ever was." "I know I will be," I replied, not unkindly. "The difference is that I earned the position instead of just inheriting it." After Glenn left, I opened my calendar and began planning my first week as CEO of Meridian Creative. In 72 hours, the most comprehensive reversal of fortune in the agency's history would be complete. And Glenn Parker would learn that sometimes the best leaders are the ones who never sought power. They simply proved they deserved it. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzle-soaked, as if Chicago itself was acknowledging the gravity of what was about to unfold. I stood at my apartment window, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up on the day that would change everything. In 8 hours, the 45-day deadline would expire, and 51% of Meridian Creative would automatically transfer to me. I dressed carefully for the occasion, not in celebration, but in respect for the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about Glenn losing his company. It was about the culmination of 7 years of work, strategy, and patient preparation finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. When I arrived at the office at 7:30 a.m., I found Emma already there, sitting in the reception area with a briefcase full of legal documents. She stood as I approached, her expression professional, but carrying a hint of satisfaction at seeing a perfectly executed legal strategy reach its conclusion. "Ready to become a CEO?" she asked, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the elevators. "I've been ready for 3 years," I replied. "I just didn't know it would happen this way." Glenn was already in his office when we reached the executive floor, and through his glass wall I could see him sitting motionless at his desk, staring at nothing. He had the hollow look of someone who had spent the night accepting an unchangeable reality. At exactly 9 a.m., Emma and I entered Glenn's office. He looked up as we entered, his face composed but resigned. "Emma Chen, representing Hannah Walsh," Emma said, settling into one of Glenn's leather chairs and opening her briefcase with practiced efficiency. "I believe you know why we're here." Glenn nodded slowly. "The deadline expires in exactly 8 hours. I don't have the money." Emma pulled out a stack of documents: ownership transfer papers, board resolutions, corporate restructuring agreements. "These documents will formalize the equity transfer as specified in your 2021 agreement. Hannah Walsh will assume majority ownership and CEO responsibilities effective immediately." "What do I need to sign?" Glenn asked, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was agreeing to. Emma spread the papers across Glenn's conference table, methodically explaining each document. "Transfer of equity interests, board of directors restructuring, corporate officer appointments." Glenn listened with the focused attention of someone determined to understand exactly how he was losing everything he thought he owned. "This document," Emma said, pointing to a specific page, "officially transfers 51% of Meridian Creative to Hannah, making her the majority shareholder. This one restructures the board with Hannah as chair and CEO, and this one defines your new role as creative director, reporting to Hannah." Glenn picked up a pen, weighing it in his hand as if it contained his entire future. "Before I sign these," he said, looking directly at me, "I need to ask you something." "What?" "Are you going to destroy what we built together?" I considered the question carefully. "No, Glenn, I'm going to improve it. I'm going to take everything good about Meridian Creative and make it better, while eliminating the weaknesses that have held us back." "My ego being the primary weakness?" he asked with surprising self-awareness. "Your ego," I agreed, "and your inability to distinguish between owning something and actually running it." Glenn signed the first document, then the second, then the third. With each signature, he was formally transferring control of his life's work to the woman he had tried to discard 6 weeks earlier. "There's something I need to tell the staff," Glenn said after signing the final page. "About what happened, about why this is happening." "What are you going to tell them?" Glenn looked out at the workspace where 60 employees were going about their morning routines, unaware that their CEO had just become their former CEO. "The truth, that I made the worst business decision of my life when I tried to fire the person who actually built this company." Emma gathered the signed documents, officially completing the most comprehensive transfer of corporate power in Meridian's history. "Congratulations, Hannah," she said. You're now the majority owner and CEO of Meridian Creative. I felt a strange calm settle over me. After 6 weeks of legal maneuvering and strategic planning, the moment had finally arrived. I wasn't Glenn's employee anymore. I wasn't his partner. I was his boss. "Thank you, Glenn," I said, standing to leave, "for making this necessary." As Emma and I left Glenn's office, my former office, I could see the curious stares of employees who were beginning to realize that something significant had just happened. In 1 hour, I would call an all-staff meeting to announce the transition. But first, I needed to move into the corner office that had always been my destination, even when I didn't realize it. Glenn Parker had thought he was replacing me with someone better. Instead, he had created his new CEO. At 11 a.m., I stood before the entire staff of Meridian Creative in our main conference room, looking out at 60 faces that reflected curiosity, concern, and barely concealed excitement. Word had spread quickly that something major was happening, and the sight of lawyers, signed documents, and Glenn's unusually subdued demeanor had fueled speculation throughout the morning. Sienna sat in the front row, still blissfully unaware that her brief tenure as creative director was about to end before it had truly begun. She had spent the morning rearranging her desk and planning what she called innovation workshops, completely oblivious to the corporate earthquake that had just reshaped her world. "Good morning, everyone," I began, my voice carrying the calm authority I had been preparing to use for weeks. "I know there have been questions about some changes happening at the leadership level, and I wanted to address those directly." Glenn sat in the back corner, having specifically requested that position so he could observe without becoming the focus of attention. He looked smaller somehow, diminished not just by the loss of power, but by the recognition of how thoroughly he had outmaneuvered himself. "Effective immediately," I continued, "I have assumed the role of CEO and majority owner of Meridian Creative. Glenn Parker will transition to creative director, where his talents and vision can be most effectively utilized." The room erupted in surprised murmurs and whispered conversations. Several employees looked between Glenn and me, trying to process this dramatic reversal of the company hierarchy they had known for years. Jody, our office manager, raised her hand tentatively. "Hannah, what does this mean for our current projects and client relationships?" "Excellent question," I replied. "All current projects will continue without interruption. Our client relationships remain stable and strong. In fact, most of our major clients specifically requested that I maintain direct involvement in their accounts, so this transition actually strengthens those partnerships." I could see relief spreading across faces throughout the room. The fear that had been building over the past few weeks, fear about job security, company stability, and uncertain futures, was beginning to dissipate. "What about reporting structures?" asked Mike, one of our senior account managers. "Great question. Glenn will oversee all creative development and brand strategy. I'll handle overall operations, client relationships, and business development. For most of you, your day-to-day responsibilities won't change significantly." Tom from our digital team raised his hand. "How did this transition happen so quickly?" I glanced briefly at Glenn, who nodded almost imperceptibly, his permission to tell the truth. "This transition has been in development for several weeks," I said carefully. "It represents a recognition that our company's growth and success require leadership structures that reflect actual operational responsibilities and client relationships." The corporate speak was intentional. I could have humiliated Glenn by explaining exactly how his attempt to fire me had triggered the legal mechanism that cost him his company, but that would have been unprofessional and damaging to the team's morale. Sienna finally raised her hand, confusion evident in her voice. "What about my role as creative director?" The room fell silent, everyone recognizing that this was the question that would clarify the full scope of what had just happened. "Sienna," I said gently, "your enthusiasm and fresh perspective are valuable, but the creative director role requires extensive experience and deep client knowledge that take years to develop. We'll be restructuring your position to focus on areas where you can learn and grow while contributing meaningfully to our success." I could see the exact moment when Sienna realized that her rapid promotion had been reversed even more rapidly than it had been granted. Her face went through several expressions: confusion, disappointment, then something that might have been relief at not having to live up to responsibilities she'd never been qualified for. "Are there any other questions about this transition?" I asked, scanning the room. Jennifer from our strategy team spoke up. "Hannah, what's your vision for Meridian's future?" I smiled, feeling the weight and excitement of that question. "Our vision is to build on everything that's made us successful while pushing ourselves to become even better. We're going to continue developing innovative campaigns, building strong client partnerships, and maintaining the collaborative culture that makes this such a great place to work." After answering a few more questions, I dismissed the meeting, watching as employees filed out with expressions that ranged from excited to relieved to quietly amused. Several people approached Glenn to shake his hand or express support for his new role, which I took as a positive sign for the transition ahead. As the room emptied, Glenn approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That was generous," he said quietly. "You could have destroyed me in front of everyone." "Destroying you would have been bad for business," I replied. "I'm interested in success, not revenge." Glenn nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I think they're excited about this change." "They should be," I said. "We're about to become everything this company was always capable of being." As I walked toward my new corner office, the office that had always been my destination, even when I didn't realize it, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Glenn had tried to replace me with someone he thought was better. Instead, he had simply made me his boss. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where Glenn had tried to fire me, looking out at a transformed company that had exceeded every projection I'd made during the transition. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated award certificates, client testimonials, and growth charts that told the story of what Meridian Creative had become under actual leadership. Glenn knocked on my office door, carrying the Morrison Hotels campaign proposal that would secure our largest contract renewal in company history. His transition to creative director had been smoother than either of us had anticipated. It turned out that when he focused on what he was actually good at instead of trying to manage everything, his creative talents flourished. "The Morrison presentation is ready," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with none of the tension that had characterized our interactions 6 months earlier. "Jennifer Morrison specifically requested that you deliver it personally." I smiled, reviewing the campaign strategy that showcased everything we had learned about balancing creative innovation with strategic thinking. "How are you feeling about the creative direction?" "Honestly, it's the best work I've done in years," Glenn admitted. "Turns out I'm much better at developing concepts when I'm not worrying about cash flow, client retention, and operational management." The transformation in Glenn had been remarkable to witness. Freed from the responsibilities he'd never been suited for, he had rediscovered the creative passion that had originally driven him to start the agency. His campaigns were sharper, more innovative, and more strategically sound than anything he had produced during his years as CEO. "And Sienna?" I asked, noting her name on the creative team roster. "She's actually turned out to be quite talented once she stopped trying to revolutionize everything and started learning the fundamentals," Glenn said. "She'll make a good account coordinator in a few years, assuming she stays committed to actually understanding the business." Sienna had surprised everyone, including herself, by embracing her role transition with grace and determination. After the initial shock of losing the position she'd never been qualified for, she had thrown herself into learning the agency business from the ground up. Her enthusiasm, channeled properly, was proving to be an asset rather than a liability. "The board meeting is next week," I said, reviewing our quarterly reports. "Revenue up 47%, client retention at an all-time high, employee satisfaction scores at their highest levels in company history." "Not bad for someone who was supposedly replaceable," Glenn said with a rueful smile. "The funny thing about being irreplaceable," I replied, "is that you don't realize it until someone tries to replace you." Glenn stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Hannah, I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. Firing you was the stupidest decision I've ever made. But somehow, it led to the best outcome for everyone involved. Sometimes, I said, the best revenge is simply proving that you never needed them to succeed in the first place. As Glenn left my office, I looked out at the bustling workspace, where 60 employees were building campaigns, nurturing client relationships, and creating the kind of innovative work that had always been our potential. The company Glenn had thought he owned was thriving under leadership that actually understood how to run it. The best revenge isn't getting even. It's proving you were always better than they thought you were. Glenn tried to replace me with his girlfriend. 6 months later, I'm his CEO, and he's finally doing the job he was actually qualified for. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply showing people what they could have had if they'd been smart enough to value what they already possessed. They thought they could replace me. Instead, they created their boss. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.